Good morning, students. I hope you continue to be safe and everything is well with you and your families. This lecture is for Monday, April the 20th. And as we pick up where we left off, we were looking at the end of the imperialistic reign that had begun in the late 19th century. Nation after nation, following the Second World War, declared their independence and went off on their own trajectory. Well, as we come to Latin America, there was a great deal of difficulty with that. Number one, especially since Teddy Roosevelt, the United States had pretty much intervened anywhere in Latin America it thought it needed to, as long as it felt U.S. interests were threatened in some shape, form, or fashion. And so that kept Latin America at a disadvantage. In addition, the U.S. and to an extent several several European nations had very undue influence on any industrial development that had taken place in Latin America. They either fully or partly owned enterprises, including the oil industry, which had cropped up. So as a result of all of this foreign influence, in several nations, militaries became the ruling brokers. And then in others, you had the rise of very violent, different kinds of cartels. Some wanted to control oil. Some wanted to control drug production and distribution. And these cartels, many of them, became extremely powerful and extremely controlling, especially in Central America. And many of the people in these countries have been forced to flee their homes, flee their towns, and go to other regions simply because of fear of these cartels or these militia groups or just pure gangs. And so there is a tremendous amount of violence that is going on in several of these Latin American states, even as we speak today. So they are still, as are many of the African states, struggling to find their identity, to find their independence, to be able to build a state of security for their citizens. Well, let's go back to the Cold War. Following the death of Stalin in 1953, the new premier, Nikita Khrushchev, began what he called a de-Stalinization of the Soviet Union. Now, what this meant was that Stalin's reign of terror was over. Now, that didn't mean that the Soviet Union was suddenly becoming democratic or it was going to build a new and great society. It just meant that a lot of the influences of Stalin were being removed, and the Soviet leadership took a slightly different direction. Khrushchev wanted to peacefully coexist with the United States. Now, we've already discussed the Cuban Missile Crisis and how close we actually came to nuclear war. And of course, that was President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. So, not all that much changed. Now, as things are going on, in 1956, in Hungary, the people demand that the process of de-Stalinization hurry up, and they began to demand democracy. And the Soviets, under Khrushchev, will respond by sending tanks into Budapest and brutally crushing the uprising. Well, then we move on to 1968. By then, Khrushchev has been replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, and Prague in the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia at the time, decided to test its wings, and it was going to see if it could possibly break with the Soviet domination. And once again, the Soviet army was ordered in, and the rebellion was once again very, very brutally crushed and brought down. As we look at what is taking place, Brezhnev will emphasize heavy industry and military, while agriculture will continue to decline. And by 1980, the Soviet Union was in trouble. Of course, part of the military is, as we're going to see, going to turn on things that are taking place in the United States. Now, between 72 and 74, as we have already discussed, Henry Kissinger will be brokering things between President Nixon and China and both the Soviet Union. And as a result of some of the work with the Soviet Union, the leaders will exchange visits, and they will sign agreements for cooperation in such areas as health research, environmental protection, space ventures, and cultural exchange programs. And the space ventures are going to be very interesting. A U.S. space capsule and a Soviet space capsule will ultimately dock in orbit around the Earth, and for 3 days, the 4 astronauts will spend time in association, discussions, and whatever with each other. Now, that sounds rather insignificant, but actually it was quite a big deal. And to be honest, some of those astronauts became tremendous friends. And for years and years after their rendezvous in space, they would continue to contact each other and visit each other as they could. So it looked like things might be improving there in the mid-70s. And then in 78, a coup in Afghanistan led to the Soviet army invading Afghanistan, and the Soviet forces were fighting Afghan forces that as we had done in Vietnam, fought the locals who were backed by the Soviets. The Soviets are now fighting the locals backed by the United States. Now keep that in mind, because things are going to turn around. But then we were trying to help them. In protest, several of the Western nations actually boycotted the 1980 Olympics, which were to take place in Moscow. And that really did not help the situation at all. And so, under Jimmy Carter, things continued to decline. And then when Ronald Reagan became president, he basically challenged the Soviet Union. And what he did was challenge them in the means of an arms race. Reagan had some information from a lot of people that led him to believe the Soviet Union was not quite as strong as they were putting out that they were. And so Reagan determined to bring them down by spending them into decline. And it will actually work. Okay, let's go back and think about some European history. 1789, the French Revolution failed in its ultimate goals. 1830, another series of revolutions across Europe. They will be crushed and fail. 1848, another series of revolutions that, for the most part, will fail. Of course, we'll have a couple of European states get their independence as a result of that. And I guess technically we can say out of the 1848 revolutions, Italy becoming a unified nation and ultimately Germany doing so were fringe benefits of those. But for the most part, revolutions that had taken place in Europe throughout the 19th century had been failures. But between 1989 and 1991, we have a new series of revolutions in Europe. And these are going to be world-changing. Literally, the Soviet Union and its satellite states are going to unwind and collapse. Now again, part of this is going to be on the part of Ronald Reagan. And we have to include what the British call the Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher, because she is going to kind of mediate between Reagan and the new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, and kind of vouch for Gorbachev that, quite honestly, he's a man Reagan could work with. And so what is going to take place are internal changes across the board that are going to bring down the communist system in Europe. And it's not that the United States goes in and conquers. It's that communism as a system finally fails itself and collapses. Now get that, students. That's important. Communism failed itself and it collapsed. So it literally will kind of unravel. Now Gorbachev will try to save the Soviet Union, the old Russia, proper, but he will not be able to do that. Now, under Gorbachev, two things will happen. He will start what is called perestroika, and this is restructuring things. So, quite honestly, he begins to lighten up on the people of his nation. And then he starts glasnost, which is openness, which actually entitled groups that were in dissent to take advantage of his new policies. So Gorbachev was going to try to get Russia to a point that they could honorably withdraw from the Cold War. And so what is going to happen is as Gorbachev begins to work on this plan, things are going to unravel in the satellite states. Now, let me say something about Gorbachev. He is probably viewed much more kindly in the United States than he is by many people in Russia today. As far as a lot of the people in Russia are concerned, they lost. And they lost face. And they were, in ways, humiliated. And they didn't care for that. And so to them, Gorbachev is probably, as I say, not as favorably viewed as he would be by individuals in the United States and Western Europe. Nevertheless, he will do quite a bit to calm down the rhetoric and calm down the threats that had been a part of our world since the end of World War II. So he does deserve credit for that. Okay, where do we start? Well, of all places, let's start in the nation that vanished from the world's map twice. Poland. Not what you would think would be the leading nation in Eastern Europe. But Poland had a very strong union of dock workers. It was called Solidarity. And Polish independence is actually going to begin with these workers. Now, why do I air quote workers? Because supposedly communism was going to benefit the workers. But the people in Poland figured out as workers, they were not being benefited. And so under the leadership of an individual named Lech Walesa, and by the way, he will become the first newly elected free president of Poland, they will actually tumble and crumble communist rule. And so Poland is going to begin to break away first. And no, the Soviet tanks didn't roll this time. So the world has definitely changed. Then, popular unrest in Bulgaria will force their leader, who had been Eastern Europe's longest surviving dictator, to resign in November of 1989. And 2 months later, a National Assembly will dismantle the communist state. And by 1990, the Hungarians will have free elections. Again, Soviet tanks don't roll. So 2 independent states have now broken away, and the Soviet Union is not doing anything about it. So in 1990, the next year, in Czechoslovakia, we have what is called a Velvet Revolution. It actually had very little violence, and the communists will be swept out of power. However, religious, ethnic, several disagreements by 93 will cause Czechoslovakia to break into two different states, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So out of the country of Czechoslovakia will actually become two nations. And there we go. So once again, we've had major changes. In 1991, both Bulgaria and Albania will become independent, breaking away from communism. So it's like a series of dominoes that have begun to fall. And then the shocker comes. In 1989 beginning, we're backing up a little bit, the chink appears in East Germany, and the Berlin Wall will actually be dismantled. The very symbol of the Cold War will come down. And I don't know how well you can see this, students, but this is actually a piece of the Berlin Wall. And I will be honest, watching the news that night, watching especially young Berlinians climbing on that wall with sledgehammers and tools and chipping away and breaking away at it, it was one of the most shocking events in modern world history, because the very symbol of the Cold War was beginning to come down. And in 1990, the two Germanys will form one nation. And of course, what's going to happen very, very quickly, as soon as Germany becomes a single nation again, American missionaries are going to be pouring into East Germany because they have been taught communism for 50 years. And so missionaries are going to be pouring in there to spread Christianity. Not everyone is going to be happy. When this is going on, my wife and I were fortunate enough to be able to take a trip to Israel and Greece. And we flew Lufthansa, which is the German airline. Coming home, I do not sleep on airplanes. My wife can. And so she was taking a nap. I was actually studying for another Western Civ course that I was teaching at the time. And I had come to the point about German reunification. And so while everything was kind of calm, people were resting and so on, I went to some of the flight crew and talked to them. And I asked some of them if they were from the former East or West Germany, and would they allow me to interview them. And one young woman who had been from West Germany said yes. One young woman from East Germany said yes. Now, the young woman from East Germany was thrilled. Opportunities galore were now available for her and her people. She embraced the freedom. She loved the freedom. Quite honestly, students, she thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. The young woman from West Germany was fine, except she said, my parents are retired and now they're being taxed to help rebuild the former East Germany. And she got quite angry when she said that. And then she got herself and said, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to come across like that. And I said, no, that's exactly what I'm looking for in an interview like this. Now, how well has the reunification of Germany worked? Well, Angela Merkel, who is the Chancellor of Germany, is from the former East Germany. And she is a pretty savvy European leader. She has pretty much been a very good leader for the German people. So for Germany, the reunification was really a good thing and way too long in coming. Now, there are going to be many in the Soviet Union that are going to be completely upset over this, because twice in the 20th century, they had fought wars with Germany, and they were afraid a reunified Germany would develop militarily again, and in developing militarily, once again, there would be a threat on the Russian people. Now, that has not materialized, but yet there was a fear. So what happened in the Soviet Union? Well, quite honestly, economic stagnation turned to a decline in Soviet living, which we've already pointed out was way, 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 way below that in the United States. And so by the summer of 1990, of course, all of these other nations are falling away. It was obvious that Gorbachev's reforms were not going to halt the downward slide of industrial and agricultural production, nor control the skyrocketing inflation. And so, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, will declare their independence in August of 91. And in the following months, the remaining 12 republics of the Soviet Union will follow suit. And so in December 91, Gorbachev will be forced to resign. And in his place, the former mayor of Moscow, Boris Yeltsin, will become the president, and he will seek to introduce a free market economy in what is now Russia. So 91 is a year of tremendous change in the Soviet Union. Now, there will be a coup that will help bring down Gorbachev. And quite honestly, Boris Yeltsin will rise up as his savior and perhaps held Russia together. And so in December of 1991, the hammer and sickle comes down, and a new tricolor flag will be raised over a new, reborn, can I say, Russia. Now, in September of 91, myself and another individual went to Russia on a mission trip. This is how much things were changing. Before, we would have had to sneak into the country. But as the Soviet Union is unraveling, we are able to travel into the country. We will actually go about halfway across Russia into Barnaul, which is in the southern region of the Altai Mountains. And we will be able to honestly plant a church there, teaching in a Russian university. Yes, welcomed and teaching in a Russian university. Now, when we arrived, the hammer and sickle was still flying. And we actually flew on a Russian airliner, Aeroflot, into Moscow, and it was quite an experience. When we got off a Russian plane, and other than some people from Ireland, we were the only English-speaking people, and there was no English spoken either in the airports or on the plane, but, we got by okay. When we arrived, there were Russian soldiers with AK-47s pointed at the passengers, not just us, but all of the passengers. So that's how uncertain things were. Now, I will tell you something that you may find a little bit interesting. We arrived late in the afternoon. We were picked up by a young Russian man named Volodya. He was our host in Moscow. Delightful individual, took us to his home. His wife fed us a most wonderful home-cooked meal, stroganoff. And by the way, if you ever go to Russia, do not say that stroganoff is Hungarian. Though they will get so upset with you, they will tell you immediately it is Russian and the Hungarians got it from them. But anyway, at 11 o'clock at night, we go to the domestic airport. Now, in Russia, you have an international airport, and then you had a domestic airport. And they were actually on two different sides of Moscow. And as my traveling companion and I got into the airport that night, of course, I had not slept on the flight going across, so it had been more than 24 hours since I had slept. And as we walk in there, the only way I can describe the domestic airport in Moscow at 11 o'clock at night is by asking you a question. Have you ever seen the original, the very first Star Wars movie? Well, when Luke goes into that bar and they meet Han Solo for the first time, there are all kinds of characters and everything else in there, all kinds of languages being spoken. That is my lasting impression of the domestic airport in Moscow at 11 o'clock at night. That's the only memory I have of it. It was definitely an interesting experience, to say the least. Now, when we got to the university, Altai State University, we were treated royally. We were totally treated royally. The students were respectful that we were able to work with. The faculty cooperated with us. We were actually staying in a home instead of a hotel, which was quite a pleasant experience as well. And so I learned an important lesson. Though governments may be in great difference politically, that doesn't always affect the feelings of the people. I grew up being taught against communism. My freshman year in high school, one semester was an entire course in how evil communism was. So that's what was being taught when I was in school. So I'd been taught against it, but I had never been taught to hate people or hate the people of the Soviet Union. And apparently, many of them had received the same kind of teachings. The governments feared each other. The governments didn't trust each other. The governments weren't in cooperation with each other. But people are people are people. Now, my second trip, I went to a preach school. I had a little 5-year-old hostess, had the blondest hair and the bluest eyes of any child I've ever seen. And if I could have possibly got that little girl on an airplane, I would have had 4 daughters when I came back home instead of just 3. Lovely child, and the only thing she could say in English was, "Hi." But she would lead me around by my little finger and take me to what I was supposed to see. And then she actually sat in my lap, and they had little cherry tomatoes that they were growing as a class project, and every one of those she fed me, I ate. And as I say, if I could have taken that child home, I would have. Well, after my tour, naturally the faculty wanted to sit down and talk about education in the United States, education in Russia, and what was changing and so on. And their first question, and this is a lesson I want you to get, young people. If you don't learn anything else in the course of this course, please, please learn what I'm about to say. So they asked, what is the biggest difference between Russian and American children? And my response was simple: the language. Those kids were thrilled to meet a foreigner. Those kids were thrilled to meet a stranger. They were lovely. The faculty was very, very pleasant. It was an all-around great experience. I have a tremendous memory of what took place at that school that day. People are people are people, students. And one of the reasons we study a course like this is so hopefully you will realize that. You know, hatred is a learned characteristic. We don't come into this world naturally hating people. And so, if hatred is learned, hatred can not be learned as well. And if we as human beings, we as American citizens, can learn to realize that African children are like American children, and Latin American children are like American children, and Asian children, if we can learn to realize people are people are people, just perhaps, hopefully, we can build a better world. A world with better understandings, where we can better get along. And people don't grow up with the fears of nuclear war or fears of another world war or whatever. Now, on my third trip, I made 4 to Russia. On my third trip, I was in the 3rd largest city, Nizhny Novgorod, and I was actually going across the city with my 6'4" female translator. And she was one of the best translators ever. That woman could think with me. And she was such a wonderful, wonderful help. But as we are traveling, I'm not with my group, it's just her and I. And as we are traveling across the city, a little 12-year-old young woman goes up to her and wants to speak to the American. And she says, "Go ahead." And so the young woman comes over, and in as good a English as I had heard in Russia, This 12-year-old converses with me almost the entire trip. Lovely young woman. Wanted to know why I was there, what I thought of Russia, and so on. But she just wanted to use her English. Now, let me get on my soapbox, students. This is my education soapbox. I think one of the failings of our American educational system from elementary school all the way through is the lack of the study of foreign language. Now, here was a 12-year-old young woman who was fluent in another language. When my second daughter was a junior in high school, a young woman from Sweden came on a student exchange and stayed with us a couple of weeks. She was fluent in English. How many American young people graduate high school and they're fluent in any language other than English? And sadly, some of them are not even fluent in English. So, we need the study of foreign language. Many of you are either freshmen or freshmen or sophomores. So you've still got some college to go. So let me encourage you to take foreign language. You don't just learn words. You learn cultures, you learn traditions, you learn lots of things. And the more we learn, and I realize, students, I'm laboring this point, but that's okay. The more we learn about other people, the better world we can tend to make it. And so let me strongly recommend that you take a foreign language. Might be a little difficult, might be a struggle. Go ahead. You need the challenge. You need the challenge. Baylor over in Chattanooga teaches Chinese as one of the subjects for its students. And people say, well, why learn Chinese? Well, who's one of the biggest trading people in the world today? China. And students at Baylor that are thinking about international business, what better foreign language could they possibly choose than Chinese? Because they're probably at some point in time going to be dealing with Chinese people. So, 1989 through 1991, the age of the modern revolutions in Europe. Not Western this time. Eastern Europe for a change. And they worked. Now, many of these countries have had problems. Yugoslavia did. But they gained their independence. And the Soviet Union and its communist system collapsed. Now, we still have some communist holdouts. Cuba, still communist. Vietnam, still communist. North Korea, still communist. China, still communist. Nicaragua in Central America, communist. It's tied to Cuba, so it's communist. And of course, Cuba tried to influence communism throughout Latin America. They just haven't had that much success at it. Okay, this brings us to our last chapter. And quite honestly, as I introduce this last chapter, and we really won't start it until Wednesday, but as I introduce this last chapter, let me say that it's going to be all over the place. We're going to cover a variety of topics as we go through this last chapter. But as we have, realize the impact of 1989, 1991. Many of those former communist states have now become a part of the European Union, and we'll talk about that in the next chapter. They have also become a part of NATO. And so they are being incorporated into the greater European economy. And to me, having grown up under that shadow of communism in Eastern Europe, this is a remarkable, wonderful change in the world. And it has very much had its impact upon the world. Okay, I realize this is rather a short lecture, but I'd rather stop here and then pick up with the next chapter next time. So you continue, students, to be safe.